Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, One Piece chapter 1164 is out. If you guys haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. Just, your typical One Piece chapter where afterwards you feel like, what a time to be alive. It just so happens that after every chapter for at least 2 years running, is a great time to be alive. You'll love to see it. I don't know if I was necessarily prepared for this chapter to just throw Emu's trauma at us. I mean, on one hand, I was prepared because we literally said in the last chapter review that it is fairly likely that Emu is a character that is full of fear. And I feel as though we've said this here or there at several points within this flashback and also within Elbaf. Oda absolutely loves foils, and we know that one of the main themes of One Piece, one of the main lessons of One Piece is live without fear. This is why the D smile before they die, because they do not fear death. This is also why Luffy's character is perfect to be the MC of this story, because Luffy doesn't act based on fears. This is low-key a big reason why Luffy is great. It's essentially the secret weapon that allows Luffy to accomplish things that other people say are impossible. This is like One Piece is on repeat doing the impossible. You don't do that if you fear. Also, just think about all the pain that Luffy has had to endure to become one of the top tiers in the verse. Pain is something that most of us can agree is very scary. We don't want it, we fear it, we avoid it, but that has shaped Luffy into the guy who's going to save the world. So naturally, with this being such a big deal in the story, it makes a ton of sense for one of the final antagonists of the entire series, whether it be Blackbeard or Emu or both or somebody else, to sort of represent the opposite of this. Somebody driven by fear. Now you might be thinking to yourself, JB, that doesn't make any sense, right? Luffy's going to become the greatest person ever because he doesn't fear. So the greatest antagonist, the current king of the world, being somebody ruled by this same emotion, like how did this happen? And for me, the logic of it, in kind of the same way as Luffy is a one-of-one person, like one-of-one throughout history, thousands of years, Luffy is a singularity. I kind of think the same of Emu. What happens when you are so driven by fear that it leads you to conquer death? It just feels like a true statement here being made about Emu. And also a concept which is perfectly inverted between Luffy and Emu. Like, you realize that for all intents and purposes, right, Luffy will conquer death. Just, he's going to accept that one day he will die, but in the meantime, he just cannot die because his will is too great. He has accepted every single challenge put in front of him, no matter the risks, the dangers, how stupid it might be, he's accepted it and found a way to overcome it, and that has made him, or will make him eventually, the strongest person. And as the strongest person, most likely, he will accomplish his dream of becoming the freest person. So strong, nobody can take his freedom from him. Nobody can force him to do things that he doesn't want to do. Nobody can kill him. And Emu has accomplished this same feat, just in the exact opposite way. Careful planning, the correct powers, or harnessing the right technology, and most likely a willingness to throw everybody else under the bus when required. But actually, the thing that we should really be highlighting here is the fact that Luffy will become the freest person, and everybody will know it, right? Like, by the conclusion of the story, Luffy is top dog. He will effectively be king of the world in terms of everyone will see him as the greatest person alive. And that is very, very different from how Emu has most likely accomplished this same thing. Emu is technically the king of the world, should be the freest person right now. However, nobody or very few people actually know that Emu exists. This probably brings us back to Emu and fear. If everybody knew that Emu exists, then Emu would be in more danger, and strong people like Rocksteady Zebek would target them and have some possibility of winning. Certainly that would be the case if everybody knew. Like, let's just be honest for a second, right? This is where the story of One Piece is going. At some point, I assume the world will know that Emu exists. But regardless of this, not many people know, and even with this advantage that Emu possesses, one person, Luffy, will discover this and most likely win. Which, in my opinion, shows how fragile Emu's grasp on power really is. You flip these circumstances, right? At the end of the story, Luffy is the greatest person alive. Is anyone taking him down? Anyone at all? Like, everyone will know he's the greatest. Everyone will target him. Is he going to die? At least while his body still functions? No. But in my view of Emu right now, and this is subject to change, and there's more that we could discuss about this, but my view of Emu right now, how it makes sense to me as the king of the world for the last 1,000 years, is Emu is probably incredibly intelligent, right? A master planner. And so Emu knows this. Emu knows that, look, I'm not going to survive for the next 1,000 years if everybody knows about me, so I'm going to disappear myself. Meanwhile, I'll contrive of a plot to make my power more permanent. And Emu's objective, most likely, in my opinion, is to flip the entire world into their servants, their subordinates, using Domi Reversi. Essentially take away everyone's free will so that it is literally impossible for someone to try to dethrone them, because they are literally, through whatever, however Emu's powers work, the mechanism of that, they are literally Emu's subordinate, forced to follow Emu's commands, which is basically the same thing that Luffy is doing as well, but Luffy is accomplishing this in the much more wholesome way of just having people that love him and would put their lives on the line for him. Unlike Emu, they won't be forced to follow his commands, they will willingly follow his commands. But anyway, I feel as though we were getting a little bit off track. The point is that Emu is clearly a character motivated by fear, a foil of Luffy, and this chapter, I think, canonized that idea. Essentially, Emu as a person, or as the person that they originally were, dreamed of acquiring the kinds of power that Luffy eventually will, right? But the problem is that there's only one Luffy in thousands of years of history. And, you can throw other names in there as well. Maybe there's others that have achieved similar status, Joy Boy or whatever. But regardless, it's a coveted treasure, the same as we've been exploring about treasures in all of God Valley. If you were out there dreaming of the most beautiful woman in the world, there's only one Rayleigh who can actually have her. So for everybody else, right, you're just left not being able to accomplish what you want. Having the most power or having the greatest treasure is simply not your destiny. And so in my opinion, Emu sort of represents this collective desire to fight against fate and destiny itself. If this isn't supposed to be my future, I will rewrite my future, accounting for all of the things that stand between me and my dreams. And all of these things that stand between me and my dreams are the things that I fear. So essentially, you're living with fear as your guide, as your ruler. And as a side note to all this very much makes it, and I'm sure it's very intentional on Oda's part, makes it where Emu might be the king of the world and be quote unquote the freest person, but Emu is very much not free. Emu cannot do what they want all of the time. And in my opinion, if you really sit down and think about this deeply, there's something about this that is incredibly profound. Emu is fighting against fate or destiny and has ultimately acquired something very similar to what they always wanted. But because it's something that they couldn't acquire intuitively, naturally, just by doing the exact thing that they want to do all of the time, right? This existence basically just doesn't live up to the hype. I think about this from time to time, but just think about Emu's day-to-day existence. What is this guy doing all the time? You're sitting in your little dungeon, all alone. The only people you ever talk to are, essentially your slaves at best. I suppose we shouldn't forget the little butterflies, right? All of this actually reminds me of a lot of the children's stories of those kids that are literally imprisoned. Think, for instance, Harry Potter and his little spider friend in the cupboard under the stairs, or Cinderella. It's genuinely sad. Emu's existence most likely is miserable in a way that we could probably compare to hell. There's nothing about what they do that is a life worth living. So cool, you've acquired something similar to the treasure that you've always wanted, but has it really amounted to anything? Is all of this worth it? And this is very much something that is thematically important in the story of One Piece, which I've argued many times for the last several years is heavily influenced and is likely a parable of the teachings of Buddhism. So let's skip ahead in the chapter a little bit and talk about something that most likely nobody else brought up but is just sitting there lurking for you to discover. Guys, I know that there are several complications to this, But we have this idea of Captain John's treasure, right? And in the last chapter of One Piece, we saw that for a moment in God Valley, Captain John acquired all of the treasure in God Valley. So in my opinion, I believe that there's some misinformation about this that we will discuss shortly. But I think that it's very possible, reading this chapter, that Captain John and Gansui died in God Valley. Look at how they were portrayed in this chapter, and the idea that they died here is not crazy. And all of this is fuel for the speculation that the island of Thriller Bark is actually originally was God Valley. We've already been told that Thriller Bark was an island that originally existed in the West Blue, I guess was transformed into a ship, and Moria sailed it into the Grand Line, right? And the big thing that people had against this theory was, well, God Valley has these giant mountains. We see in this chapter, one half of the mountain begins to fall. I assume the other half will fall as well, and by the end of it, it'll be very similar to Thriller Bark. The idea is that Gecko Moria and Dr. Hogback discovered the dead bodies of Gansui and Captain John because they were still there in the ground of God Valley. And if you have a really keen eye and you look at some of the other zombies, the general zombies that were around Captain John and Gansui that were also not named, they bear striking resemblance to other, quieter members of the Rocks Pirates. So a decent chunk of the Rocks Pirates died in God Valley. Moria found their bodies. But the reason that I bring this up is there's some misinformation out there that Captain John acquired Captain John's treasure following the events in God Valley. He was a pirate for some time after all of this and acquired some sort of new treasure. But if he died in God Valley, Captain John's treasure, we literally saw it in the last chapter, that singular moment when he used his magnet powers to suck in God Valley's treasure. That is Captain John's treasure. That was where the legend of Captain John's treasure was spawned. So let us together reread SBS Volume 49, where Oda talked about Captain John. Essentially, a reader noticed that the general zombie from Thriller Bark was Captain John. Oda says, "Yes, you found it. Well spotted. The man whose treasure Buggy and crew were searching for had become a zombie at Thriller Bark. Look close at Captain John's stomach. He has several slashes in his belly and 2 swords sticking right out. These were the marks left when his crew killed him for keeping the treasures a secret from them. John died, and the location of the treasure became a legend lost forever." In this chapter, we can see Captain John holding his stomach. Guys, I understand that Oda is being somewhat misleading here, but it seems to me that he is describing the events in God Valley. John tried to take all of the treasure of God Valley for himself, and his crew, quote unquote, mutinied, and they killed him for it. This is what has just occurred in God Valley. So now that this has been explained right, we have something tangible that is profound and also very subtle. We're literally watching Shiki and others run off with Captain John's treasure, essentially the moment that that treasure existed. For the next 40 years, people from across the sea were hyping up and looking for Captain John's treasure, and it literally could not be found. This isn't just what I think would happen. Guys, this is what the story of One Piece is likely to do, because it's a callback to almost the very beginning of the story and the legend himself, Gaimon. You're absolutely free to read for yourself. I believe it was chapter 22, something like that. I'm sure that you can find it, but the premise of Gaimon is that Gaimon was longing for a treasure and protecting a treasure on Treasure Island. And the treasure was there, he knew where it was, but he just couldn't quite get there. The struggle of being trapped within a box. So for 20 years he waited, the Strat Pirates arrived, they befriended Gaimon and helped him to finally acquire the treasure. But the plot twist was that once the treasure was found, all of the treasure chests were already empty. Which thankfully did not shock Gaimon, because shortly after this, he sort of realized or came to the conclusion he always suspected that, look, when it comes to notorious treasures, given enough time, they are probably already found. Somebody else got to the booty first. And with God Valley's treasure, Captain John, and all that, it is hilariously on point. Within minutes of Captain John's treasure existing, it was already stolen. And the whole chapter of Gaimon related to Buddhism is basically commentary about how treasure's value is very subjective and misleading. It actually turns out that Gaimon was much, much happier knowing that this fabled treasure that everyone was seeking was no longer there. And he never required it and was never fulfilled by it. He actually found something far more valuable and significantly less dangerous than that treasure on Treasure Island, which was all the little critters that he had befriended. And I know that it's been a while, but this is how all of this interrelates with our conversation about Emu actually acquiring the treasure. Essentially, Emu is a version of Gaimon that found the treasure at the top and is constantly defending it and is no more happier for it. And while you might think that this conversation is super long-winded and how much have we really said in 12 minutes of the video, I think all of this context is super important if you want to truly understand the character of Emu as they are presented in this chapter and as they'll likely be continuing in the story moving forward. One of the things that Oda loves doing, almost more than just about anything else, or it's like right up there at the top of the list, is playing with absurdities. One Piece has a ton of absurdist humor, and the absurdity about Emu, the joke that exists within his character, is that Emu is at least a 1,000-year-old being or so, right? But he is no more wiser for it. Again, another parallel or foil between Luffy and Emu is they are both children at heart, but in dramatically different ways. And I'm just gonna go ahead and say this again, like it's a distinct possibility that whenever the mask of Emu is removed, we'll find that Emu actually looks like a child. Or if not a child, maybe 17 or 18, similar to Luffy. So in this chapter, we see a lot of interaction between Emu and Rocks, and Emu comes off as childish. That should not surprise you. Emu is probably not emotionally mature, which is insane given their age. But we're literally seeing it and reading it in this chapter. So I already know that this will probably disappoint some fans, because I think that a lot of fans think from the lens of, well, the best villains in any anime or manga are characters like Crocodile, Doflamingo, Lucci, serious and smart, oozing drip and malice. Emu will of course have some of this, but there will also be this joke, and if you're not looking forward to it, at least prepare yourself for its inevitability. And this is certainly how I felt as I read this chapter. I mean, put Emu and Rocks side by side. Who is the cooler character? It is not even close. Not even in the same stratosphere. Rocks is that much cooler. And I think that all of this is on purpose because Rocks is now a father, he's lived somewhat full life, and throughout the course of his life, most likely he has grown, he has matured, and Emu has not. So as of the last chapter, Emu began to transform Rocks into a demon, and I'm really glad that Oda decided to at least somewhat nerf this ability, somewhat, at least, because although Rocks was transformed, he wasn't immediately under Emu's control, and this is also not something that surprises me greatly. I think in the last chapter review, we talked a lot about parallels between Emu and other characters, specifically Gecko Moria, the shadow guy, right? And the same applies to Moria and his control of zombies. Yes, he could take people's shadows and put them into dead bodies, making him the ruler of these zombies, but with someone with a strong will like Luffy, it took a moment before Moria had full control. Exact same thing is happening here. So I just love everything about this scene, and I especially love, as I'm known to do, reading between the lines. Like the moment that Emu transformed Rocks into a demon, Emu had won this battle. After this, Rocks doesn't attack Emu, right? So it's like the battle is effectively over, even though there's a moment where Rocks still possesses his own consciousness. But for all intents and purposes, Rocks is already dead, or like literally seconds away from dying. So what does he do before he officially dies? Our man Rocks D. Zebek smiles. And honestly, he even takes a moment to sort of gloat. Like, what I think that you need to understand is, why exactly do the D smile before they die? In part, it's because they don't fear death. That's true. But the other half of this as well is the D, generally speaking, live their lives without regrets. Which goes back to our conversation about freedom, or doing what it is that you want to do as often as possible. Or perhaps another way of phrasing this is that the D give it their best. They give it their all. They tried their hardest, accept the possibility of failure and defeat, but they put their all into it. Or as Tom might say, right, they do it with a dawn. Also, as a side note to all of this, doing it with a dawn. Dawn is the SFX, it's the sound effect of like the drums, dawn, doom sort of thing, right? But Dawn is also the name of a gang leader. Another way of saying do it like you are the boss. Do it like you are the king of the world, that you are the freest person. don't be totally shocked if "do it with a Don" also comes back to somebody like Joy Boy, who was considered to be a Don or something like that. Also, keep in mind the idea that many characters in the story currently are awaiting the dawn of the world, D-A-W-N, the dawn, the sun rising, or the dawn, D-O-N, the return of the king or the boss. The world is awaiting its dawn, its leader, its savior. Lots of wordplay happening here, not sure how exactly to phrase it. But anyway, to me it's clear that Rox died without regrets because in his final moments, he learned a great truth that he wasn't entirely sure of. And in fact, I'm not even sure that this truth that he learned is actually the truth, but regardless, it's implied, right? Emu is so afraid of the Davy clan that it confirms to Rox that his entire life's goal, his mission, his dream to, he was called a worshiper of Davy, right? Like a lot of his life probably interrelated with a quest for Davy Jones, and Emu justified it. So yes, he didn't fulfill it, right? But in the end, he learned that his quest was probably close to being on target. So in the end, he loses, but he has no reason to regret his life's work. So he smiled. And look, guys, I don't think that this is going to be confirmed for a number of chapters still, but I really think that Oda gave Rox, he was really kind to Rox in his final moment. I think that Oda could have been more cruel because I'm pretty well convinced that Rox's impression of Davy Jones is wrong, and that Davy Jones is not the savior that Rox thinks that he pursued his entire life. So essentially, Rox died in his final moments believing in a lie, but that lie was very comforting. So he states Davy Jones was once the king of the world, and Emu was like, idiot. No, he was never king. He was not even a king for a moment, Obviously, it's entirely subjective and we don't have everything that we need to know. We've not seen Davy Jones at all in the story itself. This flashback will be revealed, but I really think that Emu is simply expressing the truth, which itself is another hilarious joke because Emu essentially is a master of lies, created a world ruled by the stories, the lies that he's told, such as the Void Century never existed, which most people have believed for the last 1,000 years. But in the moment that he tells the actual truth, Rox doesn't believe him. It should remind you of Usopp. Going all the way back to Syrup Village, Usopp told constant lies. The pirates are coming, all these stories to Kaya. But the moment that he tries to reveal the truth, that the pirates were actually here, and Kaya, your butler, Clawhador, is actually this evil pirate that's trying to take your wealth, etc., right? Nobody believes him. The moral of the story is that once you are a known liar, nothing that you say can be taken as truth. And the other half of this is that people will choose to believe what it is that they want to believe, given any uncertainty. And the same here applies to Rox in his conversation with Emu. Emu says, "Nah, you're wrong." And Rox is like, "I don't believe you." And this is 100% the logical frame of mind to have. So in my opinion, Rox died believing a lie, which gave him a lot of comfort. Which is probably some kind of inversion with a character like Mont Blanc Nolan, who died with a truth that nobody would believe. But anyway, we talked more about the idea of promises in the last chapter review. The same conversation applies here. I honestly think that this chapter essentially confirmed what we speculated in the last chapter, which is basically the inherited will is a real, tangible source of power or thing in the world of One Piece. Something to the effect of, if a will is inherited and not forgotten, then one day it will eventually come to pass. This is intertwined with some kind of fate or destiny force in the story of One Piece. So despite me speculating that Rox died believing in a lie, I do think that his life served some sort of grand purpose in the destiny of the world. Guys, God Valley has been a huge commentary about this idea, but dreams are treasures. I believe that it was Davy Jones' dream or ambition or promise to one day defeat Emu, and this has been a treasure that the Davy clan has protected over the last 800 years. It's also likely been a truth, which is another treasure, a truth that they have protected for 800 years, which is, this isn't really explained, but I think that we can presume that the reason why Rox confronted Emu in Mary Joie at the beginning of this flashback is because Rox already knew that Emu existed, because this was knowledge passed down by the Davy clan, because Davy's dream was to one day defeat the secret ruler of the world. So within all of this, there is a huge conversation that I'm very much unsure that I have the ability to tackle. Like, is it really right to sort of hold this grudge or this anger to one day kill somebody? You know, it's extremely complicated, especially given the fact that we now know that this person is quite literally the devil in the story of One Piece. But regardless, I think that the Davy clan protecting and keeping this treasure, this truth, this dream over 800 years has literally affected the destiny of the world. And Emu knows it. This is the reason why Emu is so afraid of the Davy clan, and why, so far, Emu has put the Davy clan on a pedestal higher than almost anything else. Like, Emu is personally involving themselves in God Valley, which I think is an extremely rare occurrence and just demonstrates how much Emu cares. Emu cares because while this will is being inherited, while this dream or promise is being passed down, it will inevitably occur. I believe that Emu fundamentally understands something about the nature of the One Piece world to lead them to believe that if they want to survive, if they want to live, they are afraid of death, then they need to erase this particular promise. They need to kill all the remaining members of the Davy clan. And likely the same thing is true of Joy Boy and Nika. But unfortunately for Emu, making people forget about Nika is far, far more complicated than making people forget about Davy Jones, which likely says a lot about these two characters, their actions, and how people perceived them during the Void Century. Another reason why I believe Emu when they say that Davy Jones was never for not one moment king of the world. Don't think that this same thing applies as true of Joy Boy. But honestly, what I think is really cool about all of this is Rox eventually asks Emu, who do you fear more? Do you fear Joy Boy or do you fear Davy Jones? I think the answer to this question is Emu fears both equally, and for essentially the same reason. And also, as a side note, all of this interrelates with a lot of the circumstances of God Valley. Like, think about Shaki, right? Shaki is this treasure that the entire world covets, desires, dreams for. I think that you should compare Shaki to Joy Boy or to Nika. But what makes Rox D. Zebek unique is while the entire world is fighting over Shaki's love, and Rox was initially one of these people, eventually Rox moved on and found a different person that, it seems to me, he loved just as much. Do you think that Rox died believing Shaki to still be the most beautiful woman in the world? I don't get that impression. I don't believe that. I genuinely think that Rox died believing that his wife, Eris, is the most beautiful woman in the world. She is the greatest treasure, whether or not everyone is fighting over her. Like, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Again, we could bring up the Gaimon flashback because this is the entire theme, the entire moral of that chapter is that, yes, the treasure that the treasure map led to was what everyone desired, but Gaimon actually found something there that was of equal value to him, just not that treasure. Same as Luffy believing that his dirty old straw hat is his treasure despite nobody wanting it aside from him. The whole idea of the value of treasure is an illusion. So while the entire world treasures Shaki's beauty, while the entire world treasures Joy Boy and Nika, the Davy clan treasured something else that nobody else really wanted or valued. Davy Jones. It is such a genuine mindfuck to think that, Joy Boy and Nika and Luffy are like the true saviors of the world, right? Those that collectively believe that this person is going to turn the world into paradise. They are most likely correct. I don't think that this is true of Davy Jones, which is this treasure that the Davy clan has kept. At the same time, the idea that the Davy clan treasured something that nobody else did is so immensely wise. Because there's no reason to value something just because everybody else does. You absolutely 100% should love something, not because everyone else loves it, but because you do. If you have that feeling, then be your own man. But what if this thing that you love is also a lie? This is part of the story of One Piece, guys. Kaya loved Usopp's lies. They gave her comfort, they gave her joy, and subtextually, they gave her life. Usopp made Kaya a stronger, healthier person. We're all fans of One Piece, right? So we should understand this more than almost anybody else. sometimes you need a little bit of fantasy in your life. Like it or not, and I feel extremely comfortable saying this, every single person in the world believes in some kind of lie that also gives them comfort, strength, and joy. For some of us out there, couldn't be me. It's something like, Texas Tech might one day win the national championship. Total delusion, total fantasy, will never happen, but it keeps me trucking. Or more topical for One Piece fans, right? One day, the story of One Piece will finish. But yeah, do yourself a favor, and for a moment, just try to wrap your mind around the conversation that we just had, while at the same time valuing the idea of truth. And, just your brain is exploded. Mine too. It's fine. All of this takes us back to fear, specifically fear of pain, because some truths hurt. And the big one in One Piece, also the big one in life, is the truth that one day you will die. But I would actually say that there's a lot of people that don't really fear this as much as you might expect, or as much as a character like Emu, right? Really, the truth that we all fear is that everyone else that we love will also die. And I don't know any other way of saying it, but it's tough, man. It's kind of like the dynamic with Luffy and the crew, Luffy needs the crew and the crew needs Luffy. You can't have one without the other. Our loved ones need us and we need our loved ones, but separation is inevitable. So there's two ways, generally, that we tackle the problem. On one hand, we could potentially conquer death. Or on the other hand, we can collectively believe that although we will separate, one day we will meet again. The very same as the Harley text prophesies. And another word for prophesize or prophecy is promise. If you can't tell, we are genuinely talking about what One Piece is all about. Our greatest fears, which cause us immeasurable pain, and our greatest dreams, which give for us immeasurable joy. And so this very same conversation is reflected in this chapter. Emu, who is this immortal being that fears their own death and those that potentially endanger their life, while Rocks fears not for himself, but rather the ones that he loves, which are two sides of the same coin. I feel like I've been saying this a lot recently, but it bears repeating. Does Oda, in fact, cook at these kinds of levels? Yes, he does. Rocks literally asks Garp and Goldie Roger at the conclusion of this chapter, please kill me. Why does Rocks want to die? An inversion of Emu to protect the ones that he loves. All of this is very intentional. And I know that you want to sit there and judge Emu for having an inferior mind state as Rocks. Rocks is so much cooler than Emu. Totally, right? What Rocks loves is others, and what Emu loves is themselves, but self-love, love for yourself, is also something that is kind of vital to surviving life. And Oda has, in fact, demonized the extreme form of this on either side. Think Sanji as an example in Zou, leading into Whole Cake Island. Sanji was 100% prepared to die because he thought that if the Strats attempted to rescue him, they would be endangering themselves. He thought that he would be leading the crew to their deaths at the hands of the Vinsmoke and the Big Mom Pirates, so he chose to sacrifice himself, and that was the wrong choice. So the moral of the story is neither aspect of this is bad, but both are needed in some kind of balance. And I really, truly hope that Oda cooks up a storm with Emu, because such a thing is certainly plausible. Like, I'm sure that through this conversation and your own musings within yourself, you think to yourself, well, Emu is a pretty pitiful existence, like being so consumed with yourself, love for yourself to this degree, is not a quality that we endorse. If Emu just a little bit cared about other people as much as they care about themselves, then we wouldn't even be in this mess. We wouldn't have this metaphorical or literal devil. Like, essentially, if you have a soul, if you have a heart at all, and through this conversation, think that you have a great appreciation for the ones that you love, right? It is incredibly painful to think about the reality that one day, they will be gone. And so if Emu had just a little bit of this within them, hopefully a lot of this within them, it would be incredibly painful to do all this heinous, evil shit that they do. So they wouldn't do it. We said this earlier, right? We avoid things that cause us pain. We fear pain. This is why compassion and empathy has such value, because if you can see the circumstances of somebody else and feel their pain without actually experiencing it, it stops us from doing these kinds of things. But it just wouldn't shock me, guys. It wouldn't shock me if Emu is not as straightforward as you currently think them to be. Be honest, you think that Emu loves themselves and is incapable of loving others. But a incredible twist to all of this would be that Emu loved themselves and at one point in the past had those that they loved, and then they lost them. Imagine this for a second. Emu is at least 1,000-year-old being, possibly even older than that. Everybody that Emu ever loved is likely dead. Emu probably started their story as a real human, which is also relevant to this chapter because Rox has demonized Emu and calls them not human, but I think at one point Emu was a human and they grew up no different than literally everybody else. We've done a lot of parallels with Emu and Thriller Bark and Gecko Moria. Think about Dr. Hogback and Sindri. Emu may have conquered death and they may have tools available to keep people alive, potentially even resurrect people, but none of this is resulting in what Emu probably actually wants. So it just wouldn't shock me, and at the very least, it's a cool hypothetical to play around with and to share, that Emu's real objective here is to spare the world from the pain that they themselves experience because everyone that they ever loved is dead and there's no way to right this wrong. Flip everyone into demons, take away their ability to feel compassion, and everyone will be happier for it. Emu has experienced this life. They once loved, it caused them immeasurable pain, now they choose not to. Now they love the only treasure that they have left to protect, themselves, as well as the lie that they choose to believe that they have the power, the ability to save the world. Also, I hope you guys noticed how all of this conversation is interrelated with Kuma in this chapter. Kuma, I'm just gonna say it, guys, like I wasn't sure 100% how I felt after the Kuma flashback itself. Like I kind of knew at the time, wow, is Kuma actually a top 5 character in all of One Piece? Kuma might very well be the top 1 character in all of One Piece. Just like reading about this man makes me feel inadequate in the best possible way. So perhaps it's because of this that I have to believe the lie and cope that Kuma actually here reflects Sanji, you know, self-sacrifice for the sake of others, and a very extreme version of it that is probably not ideal. Although something that we collectively respect, look up to, and idolize far, far more than the inverse. Because we know how the story ends up, right? Kuma is the giving tree. He keeps giving every little bit of himself until nothing remains. I'm not going to really explore this in full in this chapter review, but I really think that Kuma and Dragon are very, very similar. It's like amounted to different outcomes in the story, but conceptually, they do the same thing. They are giving trees. But if you had one thing that you could criticize about Dragon and about Kuma, is that, you know, it's so noble to be willing to sacrifice yourself for literally everybody, people that you don't know, like to value other people's lives, to have that empathy and compassion to that degree. You know, it's incredible to read. But just something that I feel like should be said is, Kuma, your life matters as well, right? Like, you will be missed. Your loss will cause immense pain, and those that care about you, that also matters to an equal degree at the very least. I think that there's a lot of people that don't really understand why Luffy is the hero of the story and not Kuma and not Dragon, right? Because, you know, Dragon and Kuma are more so like, this is the hero. They're trying to be the hero, and you know, that just makes the most sense to them. Luffy is a pirate. Luffy does what he wants. He doesn't share his meat. He doesn't look to be a hero. This is the conversation that needs to be had to sort of bridge that understanding that Luffy is the MC and the savior of the world. The ideal person not only loves others, but also loves themselves. So when you go back and you reread this flashback, I want you to look at Dragon. I want you to ask yourself this question: does Dragon love himself? To me, the answer to this question is pretty clear. Dragon is in absolute agony at the things that he cannot do. And this is why, as far as we have seen so far, Dragon has lost the ability to smile. You know, it's almost like Dragon wants to be fair to everybody, and Dragon is fair to everybody except himself. And we could have a long conversation about this, but I think that this will end up mattering. Point blank, Dragon is not as loved as Luffy, and in fact, with recent semi-reveals in the story, Dragon is not as loved as his second-in-command, Sabo. So it's important to consider yourself, and it's important to consider what your life means to other people. And this is the last thing that we're going to talk about relating to this chapter, because I don't necessarily think that what Rox did at the end here is ideal, right? He said, "Kill me." And he did it because he wanted to save his family, and that's noble. And just the same as Dragon and Kuma, this motivates us so much. In fact, it's crazy fitting that this occurs essentially at the same moment that Kuma does the same thing, sacrificing himself to save not only like his loved ones, but people he doesn't even care about. So all of this is happening simultaneously, and I know that you experienced this chapter probably very similar to me in that like what Rox did here is super Chad. He was so cool, Kuma as well, so it's hard to criticize him for it. But if you're looking for a way to criticize him, look at what happens after this. You'll notice that despite the fact that Rox got what he wanted and we were rooting for Rox, like at least for me personally, what felt awesome was their self-sacrifice, Rox and Kuma's, but I don't feel satisfaction for the fact that Eris and Teach were saved. Why don't I feel this? I think it's because I know where the story is going. Teach becomes Blackbeard. So you have an absolutely fascinating contradiction, which is in this moment, Eris and Teach were saved, right? They were saved. But were they saved? No, they were not. We know where this story is going. We just spent a long time talking about self-love, right? And I think that it's very fair to speculate that following Rox's defeat and death in God Valley, Eris blamed herself. She even says, "I'm sorry, dear, you had to face off in order to save us, but it was too early, wasn't it?" So Eris will have a regret. Rox died because of her. And I still feel as though this is objectively true because I don't exactly understand how Garling and the world government in Emu discovered that the Davy clan was here in the first place. This is still an open-ended question that has not been revealed. And because of this, she will do whatever it takes to keep the Davy blood alive. When you really dig into the meaning of whatever it takes, it gets pretty dark. The only thing I guess we know for certain is that Blackbeard did not have a particularly happy childhood, right? Strong guess. So again, guys, I apply the same logic of the Straw Hat crew to this dynamic, right? Luffy needs his crew, and the crew needs Luffy. Well, your family, or in this case, the Davy family, needs Eris and Teach, but they also need Rox. So look, my opinion is that if you really wanted to save Eris and Teach, it is not just about saving their lives, you would also need to save Rox's life. This is how this story has a genuinely happy ending. So this is what I think Rox should have actually asked for. He shouldn't have asked for Roger and for Garp to kill him. He should have asked for Roger and Garp to save him. He didn't do that because, one, potentially he didn't value his own life, or two, also important to the story of One Piece, he didn't believe it to be possible. But in the story of One Piece, impossibilities are always possible. That is the truth of the world. So right now, there are a lot of ways that you could compare Rox and Luffy. There's a ton of similarities, parallels. There's also a ton of foils. This is one of the foils, right? And I think this is something that Oda has kept in mind throughout this entire flashback when writing Rox's character. Luffy believes in doing the impossible. He believes that nothing is impossible. Nothing will stand in the way of achieving the thing that he wants. He'll never stop believing until the moment that he has failed or died. And in this way, Oda sort of highlighted earlier in the flashback, Luffy and Roger are very similar. Roger basically said pirates don't give up pursuing their treasures. But of course, Rox is the opposite of this, and Shocky is the character that demonstrates this concept. When obtaining Shocky's love was beginning to appear to be impossible, Roger kept trucking. For Rox, however, when Shocky's love began to appear impossible to obtain, he moved on, he gave up. he stopped believing. And something very similar occurred between him and King Harold. So all of this was masterfully handled, and it makes complete sense that Rox was transformed into a demon, didn't believe it possible to be untransformed, so didn't even consider that to be a possibility, and that was his mistake. You know, Rox sometimes comes across as an incredibly wise character, but he is also an incredibly flawed character. He thought he was saving Eris and Teach, but there was just something within all of this that he hadn't considered, some truth that he didn't know, and no, his family was not saved. But once again here, and I'm assuming that Rox ultimately dies, once again here, probably not a coincidence, Rox died, believing a very comfortable lie. And I think that Oda also hinted at sort of the deeper subtextual layers of this discussion within the chapter between Roger and the Roger Pirates and Rayleigh and Shocky, etc., right? Like, Rayleigh says, after Roger decides to go and fight Emu, you know, I hope Roger is okay. And it was in fact very important to Shocky and Rayleigh's future that Rox did eventually leave God Valley and was okay. But anyway, guys, I'm sure that we could talk forever about the intricacies of this chapter. There's so much more that you could potentially unpack, but I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it here. This was another incredible chapter of One Piece. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys think, whether you noticed something from the chapter that I might have missed. Share your thoughts. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.